I'm not okay. I just would say this, and when we talk about grief, it's okay not to be okay. How are you doing? What's our traditional response? Fine, right? Yeah. And sometimes I say to people when they ask me, well, how honest would you like me to be on a scale of 1 to 10? And sometimes, how many would bear witness with me that some days are not okay? And some days the pain that we feel is real. And I just would say this, it's okay not to be okay. It's okay. And you're at a safe place here today. We're at Cedar Hills. We say, oh, you're not okay? This is a good place for you to be. Welcome. And today we're going to talk about grief. And as we're in this series, I think, in my opinion, grief is some of the hardest work we do as humans. Grief is not simple and not easy. It's hard work to do. In the book, Emotionally Healthy Spirituality, as Doug mentioned and it's been mentioned before, that this author, Peter Scarsirzo, he really talks about that spiritual maturity. You can't be spiritually mature without being emotionally mature. And so this sense of being healthy, holistic spirituality, integrating the way of truth, the way of God in all areas of our life, mentally, emotionally, relationally, physically, that Jesus is calling us to follow and integrate the way of God in all areas of our life for our health and well-being. My opinion, healthy is the new holy. Just give me healthy people, right? That's really what I believe Jesus is calling us to. And those of you that have been in the recovery movement, AA, SA, or the organization that I work for, my wife and I work for an organization called Pure Desire. We help deal in the area of sexual addiction for men and women, as well as betrayed trauma, the partner who's been betrayed. We have group curriculum for young adults, college age, men, women. It's really a wonderful movement. But if you're in the recovery movement, there's a mantra that says, you got to feel to heal. Everyone say that with me. You got to feel to heal. Feel to heal, right? Feel to heal. And when you're around people that are emotionally healthy, they don't numb out their feelings. They actually can feel great joy, and they can also feel great sorrow. So that sense of being open and honest about feeling. Now, I just want to address this whole thing about addiction and recovery. Sometimes I've heard churches, and this is kind of amusing for me, but they would say, our church has something for addicted people. And I'd say, I hope so. And here's why. We're all addicted to our way of thinking. It's the universal problem called sin. Just look at the person next to you right now. Go ahead and look at them. You're sitting next to an addict. Yeah, you didn't know it, but you are, right? We're all addicted to our way of thinking, and we're all in need of recovery. This is the message of Jesus called salvation. Come and follow me. Let me bring hope and healing in your life. Sozo is the word to make us whole. So our church doesn't have recovery for those people. Aren't you glad for that? We have recovery for all of us. But sometimes there's so much stigma in life, and we talk about grief, and there's stigma around even suicide or certain addictions. There's stigma around them that sometimes keep us from moving toward healing. And I really believe that grief is a big part of the healing of our lives. Well, let me just give you a couple terms here with grief that would be helpful. Some definitions. Grief, the appropriate emotional feeling inside of us in response to loss. So the appropriate response to loss is grief, right? Our grief isn't what's wrong with us. Our grief is what's right with us. It's the appropriate response when we go through a loss. How about this next term, mourning? Mourning is the outward expression or the public display of emotions or reactions to loss. So mourning is not just when we feel it, that's we grieve, but mourning is actually when we display it. Have you ever been around someone that's really grieving, pouring out their heart, crying, right? So that's that public display of our feelings when we have those. Here's another one, shadow grief. These are weeks prior to or anniversaries of a loss. Maybe some of you here today have lost a spouse or a parent. My friend Vince came up to me afterwards. He lost his granddad. He's 11. And he said, that talk really helped me. Now, when your 11-year-old helps somebody, how many know you're actually doing something good, right? I mean, like, about time, right, Rodney? I mean, come on, But anyway, because we all feel it regardless of our age. And I love his honesty and openness about, wow, I can process some of that. But shadow grief is the anniversary. Hey, it's that time of year when I lost that. Last November was the anniversary of my dad's loss, and I was really missing him that day. It was the day of, like the 28th of November, and I was in Portland, and I was just thinking, man, I miss my dad. And I got out of my car to go into an office, and man, there was this Cessna 172 that flew right over the top of me. That's the plane my dad used to fly. And I was like, the Lord let my dad out of heaven just for one last flight, you know? But how many have missed somebody, and all of a sudden something comes in your world where you go, oh, that reminds me. And, oh, what a gift. But sometimes certain seasons in life, the spring, the fall, the winter, certain times we can begin to feel that. That's called shadow grief, prior to or after the anniversary of a loss. And then the last one here is anticipatory grief. These are feelings or emotions or reactions that occur prior to a loss. We have a spouse that maybe, or a family member that has a terminal illness, and we're walking with them, we're navigating that, a cancer, something that is life-threatening, that we know it's our time's getting short. And then sometimes our grief can actually happen before they die. And so it's called anticipatory grief. And so sometimes when that individual, now the loss happens, the death occurs, this person could actually feel, maybe a spouse or a parent or a caregiver, they can actually feel relieved or even maybe a sense of joy. And they think, what's wrong? I shouldn't feel this way. I just lost my brother, my sister, my husband, my wife, my son, whatever. But part of that is they did some of their grief work prior to the loss of the individual. Does that make sense? And what the joy is that that individual is no longer suffering. In fact, I think it's a very unselfish thing, and I've been there many times with families, when someone prays, it's okay for you to go, Dad. You're suffering, and I want your suffering to be done. That's unselfish. Because selfishly, I don't want my dad or my loved one to go. I don't want him to go. Stay here with me. But unselfishly, I can say, hey, I got hope beyond the grave. Death has been defeated. There's good news awaiting you. How many are glad for that, right? Death isn't the final voice. It's not the showstopper of the love of God, right? That God transcends death, that God entered into our condition, suffered, grieved, died, and conquered death. This is for us, those of us who follow Jesus and are here today, are so grateful for a God who stands in solidarity with humanity in the cross. A God who suffers, who understands pain and heartache and grief. Those are some definitions. How about the process of grief? Let's look at the process of grief. Acute grief can last about 1 to 2 years in a loss that occurs in our life or a trauma. 1 to 2 years. Carryover grief can last 3 to 5 years. It can be longer, that sense of carryover grief as we're processing that. How many wish grief was neat, clean, and orderly, and you just went through it and then it was done? My grandfather died. I'll never forget it. Emmett Trentham, Chowchilla, California. We had his funeral. And my nephew, Courtney, was about 11, and his cousin, Johnny, was sitting right next to him. And Johnny was older. Johnny was probably in his late 20s, 30s. And Johnny's just sobbing because of missing Grandpa. And Courtney's sitting right next to him, and Courtney says during the service, Johnny, don't worry, this only lasts about an hour. Don't you wish grief only lasts about an hour? Right? You can just have a good cry, and then there you go, it's gone. But I have found that grief sometimes can hit like a wave, regardless of where we are. We're in a grocery store, and I grab something, and I think, oh, that reminds me of that. Oh, and I start to feel that, right? And sometimes we get overwhelmed in situations because grief hits us like waves that comes and goes. Acute grief, 1 to 2 years. Carryover grief, 3 to 5. Unresolved grief can last a lifetime. That's grief that is so painful, we don't even want to go there. So we hide it, we cover it up, right? It's the big mound with the carpet over it in the room. Don't worry about this. It's the elephant in the room that we don't address because it's too painful to go there. That grief doesn't go away. Many times the grief comes out sideways. Let me give you an example. In our healthy state as individuals, as human beings, we would say as we mature as Christ followers, so spiritual maturity. In spiritual maturity or in health, When Rodney goes through a loss, and I'm currently have been navigating one the last 4 years in our home, just with some mental health issues that have been really, really painful. But in my healthy condition, I process these losses with other people. This is what I feel, this is what's happening in me, and I let it out, right? In my unhealthy state, I don't want to feel that. So I want to change that feeling, and so I grab something to cope with. You get what I'm saying? And in my unhealthy state, in my immature spirituality, regardless of my title, I can cope with something here. And these things can be super unhealthy, or they can just not be healthy, right? How many know meth is not a good thing to cope with? Right? How many know cheeseburgers is not really a good thing to cope with? Now, come on now we're talking, right? Now I'm pointing the fingers right here. Because I have found sometimes, I don't want to feel that, but man, a cheeseburger really feels good right now. Right? Right? My wife, Tracy, would say, when Rodney got help with his addiction, I didn't like it, and it was very painful, but it helped me realize I guess maybe I can have permission to deal with mine as well, right? And so that sense of like carryover grief can last a lifetime. I'm going to keep moving here through my notes. So let's talk a little bit about this, grief. What does grief come from? Well, grief comes from this. It comes from loss or trauma that happens in our life. Trauma can be big T trauma, or it can be small trauma, right? But there are things that happen in our life like this. Grief and loss comes in like death. It comes in divorce. It can come in abuse or abandonment, or a shattered dream, or an unmet expectation, or betrayal, or a trauma event like the house burned down. We got in that bad wreck. Someone broke in and took the things that were dear to us, and they robbed our house. Have you ever been robbed? There's a trauma, like a violation has happened here. Some have even told me that empty nest, there's grief in that, or I think so too, but I had a little more joy than I actually had grief. But I've heard, right? You know. How about some of the unmentionables like suicide, or mental health crisis, or a broken relationship, or a chronic illness? I'm trying to help you see loss and trauma comes in a lot of different ways in our life, not just through death. So if you have this broader understanding of, hey, things happen in our life that are extremely difficult. Some things are senseless tragedies. They're hard to make sense of. And some things we can clearly see, this caused this, and the results can be overwhelming. Life happens. It's the promise of Jesus in the Bible that makes me mad. I love a church where I can be honest like that. It's when Jesus said in John 16:33, in this world you will have trouble. Man, I don't like that one. Can anybody resonate with that someday? When trouble knocks on your door. I had a friend who she just recently posted about her dad, and she said, I hate the C word, cancer, right? When trouble knocks on our door. But if you read the rest of the verse, Jesus says, take heart, I've overcome the world. Boy, I'm grateful for that. There's the good news. We're not alone in what we go through. And again, that song, He's in the Waiting. This is a God who stands in solidarity with human loss and trauma. This is a God who went through it for us and says, you are never alone in what you're going through. Fear not, for I am with you. This is the hope of the gospel. God's not distant, far away, hoping that we get everything together, then they're going to come help when we say the right thing, do the right mechanism. No, this is a God that says, as close as your breath right here, this is where I'm at, and I've come to help us. Well, lest you think I'm not a Christian or a good preacher, I've got some other scriptures to read here today on grief. Let's look at those. Ecclesiastes says this, for everything there is a season, a time for every activity under the sun, a time to be born, we dedicated some young kids here today, and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to harvest, a time to kill, and every hunter said, amen. Harvest is really the best translation here, but anyway, a time to kill and a time to heal. A time to tear down and a time to build up, a time to cry and a time to laugh, a time to grieve and a time to dance. Look at this other text here. John 11:35. I got a Bible buck for memorizing this scripture. Only 2 words, kids. This one will get you a good one. Jesus wept. This was at the funeral of his dear friend, Lazarus. He wept. You ever seen someone weep? Literally just sob? Jesus wept. Look at this next scripture. Be happy in Romans. Be happy with those who are happy and weep with those who weep. There's something about empathy, entering into others' journey. When they're excited, celebrate with them. And when they're going through it, stand with them in solidarity, that they're not alone. So these texts, one more text, Revelations. So in the scriptures, in the Protestant Bible, which we're a part of the Protestant faith, the scriptures, in the last book, the book of Revelation, it kind of gives us a window. John had a revelation about the other side, what is going to be like. We would call it the kingdom of God or heaven or what's beyond this life. And John saw this beautiful picture that he says this about heaven. And he, referring to God, will wipe away every tear from their eyes. And there'll be no more death, no more sorrow, no more crying or pain. All these things are gone. What's this word? Forever, forever. That's why we wrote songs like What a Day That Will Be, right? What a day when all of that will be gone, right? That's the hope we have. And that's what you heard in this song that we just listened to. I'm not okay, but it's all going to be all right. That's the hope, right? The hope is that we grieve, but we don't grieve as those who have no hope. And that's what I want to really help us navigate here today and talk a little about in these minutes left. Well, there's stages of grief. And typically, when you look this up clinically, they'll talk about 5 stages. They'll talk about denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. They would be a general stages of grief. But I have a friend, her name's Joanne Petrie. She is a bereavement counselor in the Portland, Oregon area. And she did a course called Grief Release. When I came to Coeur d'Alene to pastor there in Coeur d'Alene, we brought this grief class. And now it's held at the Kroc Center. It's still going on down there. And we've probably seen 4,000 people go through this class just teaching the community about grief and the importance of grief and how to navigate loss. This is so crucial information, in my opinion. And in her teaching, she just broke this down to 3 points, right? 3 things to begin to, words to hang where we can understand maybe a framework of the process or stages of grief. And here's the first one. The first one is shock. When something happens, it creates a sense of shock for us. And in that shock, sometimes it can we can almost get numb to it because maybe the pain's too unbearable. It's overwhelming. So the shock kind of numbs us again. So it's like, man, it's almost like insulation from how difficult this is. And that's why in the stage of shock, sometimes people say, man, it's been 6 months or a year later, and I feel worse now than I did when this loss happened. Well, it's because the shock has wore off, right? But that shock, that sense of numb and overwhelm. And if we're not careful, we can get stuck in this phase, and shock can turn to denial, right? It can be tricky here, right? But that sense when you find out or something happens and you're shocked by the loss, a tragic loss, or something that comes your way that you were unexpected. You know, it was October this time of year, 1997, so 27 years ago for me, that I was getting help with my addictive behavior. I was coping with some of the traumas in my life with sexuality, mismanaging my sexuality. I confessed to my dad and my brother, and I've shared my story. But during my counseling with this therapist, he said to me, Rod, you're going to want to let your wife know exactly why you're here. And when you do, you might want to give her some time and space. Now, we don't do disclosures. This is what we call disclosure. There's better ways to do this than I did it, but this was almost 30 years ago, right? You do the best you can with what you have. So I'll never forget that night in October when I said to Tracy, my wife, young, 8 years married, a couple kids, and I said to her, Tracy, the reason I'm in therapy is because I'm mismanaging my sexuality with pornography, and I've got this sexual addiction. Well, for her, this was a trauma. This was a shock This is not what she signed up for, right? She thought, if I delight myself in the Lord will give me the desire of my heart. And I delighted myself in the Lord, and the Lord let me marry a pervert. And she was mad at Rodney, livid, but she was fiercely angry at God. You with me? Because she thought if she did everything this way, that God would do it this way, and life didn't happen that way. Life threw her a curveball. I tell people, you can trust God. He handled the wrath of my wife, Tracy. He's strong, trust me. But her response was overwhelmed. It was actually the correct response to the trauma that came her way. For her, she had to get safety. She loaded up the kids that night and went away, and that's a whole story of our journey and us coming back and spending a week in intense counseling, navigating my story. Now we have groups and men and women that struggle in this area. You can get help and walk down a way better road and a simpler or a pathway so you're not so alone. But she was overwhelmed. She was shocked. It was like someone backed up a truckload of bricks and just fell on her. If you're a betrayed spouse, male or female, you know the shock that can come and the grief that can come with loss. If you've navigated a divorce or you were waiting for something to happen positive and it didn't happen, you know the pain and the shock that can come. Well, the second stage is suffering. This is when the shock wears off, and now there's just these emotions like anger and guilt and rage and depression. Or we have things like we say, if only I had done this or done that, maybe this pain or hurt wouldn't have happened to this person, right? And so this is part of it. This is the difficult part of grieving, is the pain. And like I said earlier, I wish the pain was just simple and you could just get rid of it and it wouldn't come back, but it does come in waves. And so what are we going to do with it? We have to say goodbye sometimes to a relationship that it existed the way it did, and now it can no longer exist. Why? Because divorce happened, because death happened, because a tragedy happened, because we lived in this town, but this house burned down. Think about all the people in Florida with the hurricanes that are going in, and now they come back to everything they had destroyed. You know what's needed there? Not just food and water, but emotional support for people who are navigating this horrific loss of life and the suffering that comes, right? Because when the cameras stop rolling, guess what's still happening in Florida right now? They're still cleaning up, right? That'd be a great thing to do, is just get a relief team and go down there and just support. We did that with Katrina. We went down there and not just help rebuild stuff, but we did grief workshops for the community. Let them come there in Slidell, Louisiana, on the north end of Lake Pontchartrain, and just try to help people with this suffering. And in suffering, we don't want to. This is like I said, I think grief's some of the hardest work we do. This little picture that I show you here today is probably one of the most suffering things I've experienced in my life, that I've just witnessed and tried to stand in solidarity with people. This was a portrait that was drawn about 13 years ago, a little boy named Connor. He was 7 years old. He drew this picture 11 years ago, about a week before today. And he gave it to his dad, Bob, and he said, Daddy, this is us. And we're out in this is like what heaven's like. And there's a sunshine, and there's animals, and this is a wolf, and this is a bunny, and this is elk. So obviously it was just cow tag season here with the elk, obviously. And the crosses represent Jesus. And then he wrote his name on the cross. And he said, Dad, this is what heaven's going to be like. And this is what he drew around October 7th. And then, later, that next day or two, he and his dad and another young boy and another father went hunting. And when they came back from being out in the woods, they were putting the guns away, and the gun discharged, and it took Connor's life. It was a senseless tragedy. It was horrific. It's the worst loss that any parent can have, is to lose a child at any age and any stage. And those of you in the room today who have lost a child, I'm so sorry for your loss. At the funeral we conducted, the mom was from Peru and the dad was from Mexico. And I remember it just like yesterday. The casket was open. The service was over. We dismissed everyone to go outside, and we're going to do a balloon launch. And we waited with the family for about a half hour because they knew once they closed Connor's casket, they would never see their son Connor again. And they didn't want to say goodbye. And death separates us. The relationship can no longer exist. And so they were literally sobbing. And Dexter Yates and I, Yates Funeral Home, we literally had to physically help them away so that we could shut that and start the process of saying goodbye. And in grief, part of the pain isn't just saying goodbye, although it's extremely painful when we put someone to rest at a cemetery. It's extremely painful. But how many know we have to say goodbye all through life in different aspects as anniversaries come and birthdays come and situations come where that person is no longer there and life has given us a loss and a trauma and it can't exist like it used to. And I don't want to go to new normal. I want this normal back. I want my little son back. This isn't right. It isn't fair. And I feel that at whatever level I can with empathy for individuals. Many times when I drive up to Sandpoint, I think about a January, February day at Port Hill, just up the road here, right on the Canadian border, where we said goodbye to little Luke, little Blake Johnson, just a little newborn. You know, there's nothing right about a 2-foot casket. Suffering. The individual who says, my marriage didn't make it, and now it's Valentine's Day, and I don't like this day. The mom who's had miscarriage after miscarriage, like my niece Leslie, and she says, Uncle Rod, Mother's Day is the worst Sunday because it reminds me again of all the losses that I've had. And she's so empathetic. She feels people's pain. When she goes to church now with her 2 little girls that are like miracles, because she knows what it's like to feel loss and pain, to be empathetic. I think this is part of our spiritual maturity journey when we can see people and what they're going through. We can feel. You got to feel to heal. Release. Another part of release is forgiveness. I'm landing this plane. My time has come. Forgiveness is a piece of this as well. And let me just say this about forgiveness. Don't use forgiveness as spiritual bypass, right? Spiritual bypass is like, I don't want to go around the pain, so, okay, no big deal, I just forgive you, right? That's not forgiveness. Forgiveness is, I don't want to feel any negative feelings, so I'm just going to forgive. No. Forgiveness is a tool that helps you deal with the negative feelings, right? Instead of keeping them inside and being embittered, forgiveness helps you to what? Forgiveness helps you to hand them over to God, to let go of the pain. I forgive you up to God. Someone says, Rod, you're still angry, haven't you forgiven? And I said, yes, 9 times this hour. And I'm probably going to do 9 times tomorrow as well because I'm still angry about the loss or the pain that was caused. But forgiveness isn't an emotional state. It's a tool that keeps me from being embittered. Do you see it? Do you get it? Right? Release. Letting go of pain. And as we wrap up to the end, and there's notes on the back of your bulletin that have these next steps that you can help people. But let me say this as we conclude here today. One of the greatest gifts you can get to other people is when you just see them in pain, is you help them just let their pain out and say it's okay. Tears on the outside, they fall to the ground and they slowly wash away. But tears on the inside, they fall on the soul and they stay. And they stay, and they stay. We were meant to grieve. You don't have to give them words. You can just give them a hug. Ask permission. But how many know sometimes a hug does a lot of good things? You can just be there and say, I'll be with you. You don't have to be alone in this dark day, right? In my dark days, I was so glad people were just with me. When people that I know go through dark days, I'm so glad I don't have to fix them. I can just join them to help weep with those who weep. Say, you're not alone in this day. Well, as we conclude, let me just give you permission to this. If this talk has helped you realize, I've got some unresolved issues of loss that I've never really grieved. You don't need my permission, but I give you permission to have the courage to find competent resources and compassionate people that can walk with you. And I know that this fellowship and our church with staff or people here, we'd love to help you if we could, right? So be kind to yourself today. Love yourself well. Well, doesn't this feel wonderful? I think we're about to conclude. As my dad would say, it's time to land the plane, Rodney. So we're going to land the plane on this talk. Would you stand up with me? Let's practice. Let's turn and give someone a hug. Go ahead, turn and give someone a hug. Hey, this is your chance, guys. If you've always wanted to, you can thank me later, right? And God bless you guys. You're dismissed. Thank you for being here with us today.